Good day, everybody. I'm David Walker, Executive Director of the School of Policy Studies. It gives me a great deal of pleasure today to introduce to you Victor Rabinovitch, who is Adjunct Professor and Distinguished Fellow in the School of Policy Studies here at Queen's. And Victor's going to ask the question of us, is this cultural revolution for real? For many years, for more than 11 years, Dr. Rabinovitch was CEO of Canada's largest museum institution, the Canadian Museum of Civilization, now the Museum of History, and the Canadian War Museum. During his tenure, these museums dramatically expanded their collections, their exhibitions, and infrastructure, including the construction of the new War Museum. Previously, he was a senior public servant in both federal and provincial governments and in the Canadian Labour Congress. He was responsible in Canadian Heritage for national policies and programs in broadcasting, arts, and culture. And he writes widely on issues in Canadian history, identity, and culture. He's a graduate of McGill University and the University of Sussex. He's a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal for service in promoting Canadian history. And he's a wise man, and when you attract the John Meisels of this world to listen to Victor, you know that you're in the right place. So with delight, Victor, thank you for being here.
David, thank you so much, and I'll just say, if my voice is a little bit quieter or weaker than it should be, these things just happen, so I'll try to talk up, and if you can't hear me, Mr. Speaker, you may call me to order and tell me to speak up. Before I proceed with anything, let me say what a pleasure it is to see John Meisel here. Professor Meisel, Emeritus Professor Meisel, was the chair of the CRTC, which is so important in broadcasting and public policy, in the early 1980s. He was there in one of those stages of technological disruption when something called pay television was coming into being. He has been the creator of cultural policy course here at Queen's, and he is responsible, together with Bob Wolf, for dragging me down to Queen's way back when, and I thank him for being here. I thank Bob for being here, and what a pleasure it is to see you in such fine form. I look forward to your questions. These are digits, but the digital revolution is something else. The last 3 weeks in Canadian public affairs has been an amazing time for anyone who's sort of interested in politics, and of course people in this room are very interested. Just think about it. The NAFTA negotiations ongoing and seemingly wending their way towards either important conclusions or an important rupture. We're not sure, but clearly the issue of our times for us and for the Mexicans, and frankly for the Americans, even though if you spend time in the States as I do, you don't hear about NAFTA at all unless they're reporting on it politically. So the NAFTA issue, the sale of Bombardier, which of course is such a huge issue technologically. It is not just a Quebec issue, far greater than that. Of course, the small business tax issue, and dressing it up around as a personal politics issue around Mr. Morneau's personal holdings, the way of personalizing big issues and then reducing the big issue to something very small, as in how did Morneau report or not report his personal holdings. It's, I know it's politics, but it's always a little bit disappointing, but it's a huge issue. And then one other issue that was so large for about 5 days in English media and continues to be a big issue in French media, which is the Digital Cultural Policy Review. And that, of course, is part of what I'm going to be talking about. So all of this going on at the same time, and for anyone interested in substantive politics, not the silliness of the way the substance of Brexit negotiations are handled in England these days, and it's handled in such silly ways, yet such a humongous issue. But substantive politics, substantive issues, the last 3-4 weeks in Canada really can't be beaten. I mean that in a most positive way. It can't be beaten because it's so much substance, so many issues. My presentation then this afternoon is essentially in 3 parts. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on context, and if I were speaking in Quebec, a lot of this context stuff would not be necessary. In English-speaking Canada, of which Queen's is such a central part, talking about culture and what is the policy importance of culture remains a very important thing to do, setting the context. So if I'm going over a few things that you may already know, just bear with me, and if you don't know, please enjoy it. And the second part is to talk a bit about the Canadian cultural model. Again, extremely important. Again, in Quebec, it is more understood, although often in Quebec, it's talked about as le modèle québécois, not understanding that, in fact, it's a Canadian national or pan-Canadian model. And then finally turning to the issues of our time, which is the digital revolution. Well, the Canadian content in a digital world was announced by Melanie Joly in April of 2016. And she announced at that time this review is going to be dealing with all kinds of issues. Everything is on the table, she said, and said repeatedly. So copyright law, telecoms, telecommunications law, broadcasting law, regulations, the CRTC rulings over time, the Globe and Mail, quick to give answers for everything, had an editorial one day later saying, isn't it great we're going to get rid of Canadian content regulations? I'm not quite sure who was smoking what in the Globe and Mail editorial room that night, but the Globe had already had its conclusions within one day. All issues of funding, and the minister, some beauties in her press interviews at the time. One that always stuck out for me, Canada has never had a cultural export strategy. Poor Sheila Copps, who had developed a major strategy that was well known and well established at the time, but I'm sure as a good Boy Scout, she did not call her successor to the carpet to say, what are you talking about? Anyhow, one of the brilliant quotes at the time. And another very important one where she as a minister really stuck her neck out. She said, I think, I'm translating from the French, I think digitally first because I'm a product of my generation. She's 38 years old. My career was built around non-traditional models. And it is true that her political career, where she almost became the mayor of Montreal just a few years ago, was really quite striking. But the first reactions within the cultural world, and generally amongst the political observers, was, where is this major cultural review coming from? Ministers get mandate letters. Everyone in the policy courses will know about that. And the mandate letters were actually made public for the first time in the federal government. Ontario government has been doing it for some time. And the mandate letters set out in 3 pages, closely written, closely argued, what the minister is expected to do within the first year to 2 years of the minister being there. And this minister's mandate letter, very detailed, very well written. People have obviously done their research 2 years ago in preparing the mandate letter. Nowhere does it say that there should be a major national policy review. So this really came in from out of left field. There had been some musings amongst some of the people who hang around. There's always people on the edges, people like myself, very much on the edges, saying, gee, you know, wouldn't it be nice if we had another royal commission like the Massey Commission of 1950, 1951? Wouldn't that be a nice idea, as if somehow this would clarify everything and we'd understand the technology revolution? But that wasn't going anywhere. That was just chat, chit-chat. In Quebec, where the minister was getting a lot of press, there were very quickly some musings about what is this minister trying to do? Where is she coming from? What is she trying to achieve for herself? Now understand that politics in Quebec are very personal, like politics in Newfoundland, right? Very personal. You're a good Newfoundlander. We've talked about this. So in Quebec, Quebec is simply Newfoundland with 10 times the population. It is very personal, and everybody knows everybody. It got very personal very quickly. What is Melanie Joly trying to do? Why is she grandstanding? Why is she giving so many interviews around something that doesn't seem to have really been well prepared? And in my policy class 2 years ago, we actually filled out, or a year and a half ago, we filled out online. Everybody did their own answers, but we all answered the online query on cultural policy issues. It's as if an online sondage poll is statistically accurate. Well, of course it isn't. It says there's no relationship to real statistics. But it is a poll of opinions of people who happen to fill out their views. And in the class actually broke apart for a while. 27 people in the class arguing with each other about, what does this question mean? This is ridiculous. How is this worded? And I had to call them all to order and just say, take it at face value, assume that it's all well-meaning. But the online polling that had been prepared shortly after this announcement was so badly written, so badly constructed, that a whole group of graduate students just thought it was a laughing matter. So that's a measure. But the problem is that culture and cultural policy are really serious matters. They're serious matters, obviously, in Quebec, where you get a visceral reaction on issues of culture. They're serious matters in Canada, the rest of Canada. Quebec is a part of Canada. And anybody watching the discussions around Gord Downie and the late Gord Downie and the Tragically Hip, in addition to all the personality side of pop music, there's been this underlying theme of the Tragically Hip got it. They expressed it. We understood something. They understood something. So I simply say that while in Quebec it's loud, visceral, it's there, in other parts of Canada, culture is there. You just have to scratch below the surface a little bit. So what do we mean when we say culture? Obviously, the classic anthropological understanding of culture. Culture is language, it's customs, it's values, it's narratives, it's lifestyles. It's the way a country, a region, a company, a university, a family, we talk about family culture, certainly talk about company culture. It's the way groups of people talk to each other and express things to each other in code. They understand each other's culture. Culture as expression, of course, is culture as performance, culture as art, culture as creativity, the products of culture that we consume, the Tragically Hip music. My daughter in New York sends a message this morning saying, have you been streaming the hip all day? So in New York, at a distance, 11 years she's lived away, but the hip means something to her and her generation. So culture as performance, and the core concept behind it is that culture as performance gives a voice to our identity. It expresses values, it expresses our experiences, and public policy has a role in all of this because public policy is an enabler. Through the use of public policy, culture as performance, as art, as creation, as communication, culture is enabled, becomes more cost-effective, supported, perhaps even profitable. So these are themes I'm going to come back to time and again. I'm going to give an example of something that I really enjoy, which is culture and visual identity. And so this is kind of an intermission here, just for the fun of it, simply because I love these three visual examples of where culture as art, culture as display, and also culture as public policy all come together in three visual icons. And I've chosen the three from America, from France, and from Canada. And the first one is the wonderful one of Washington crossing the Delaware. It was only painted in 1856, but it goes back to a battle in 1776, the Battle of Trenton, and there we have Washington, and as a number of people have pointed out, number one, the boat that he's on would have sunk given the weight that is on it. Washington standing up there together with his wooden teeth. Washington, you've all seen his wooden teeth. Go to the museums, they have them on display. Washington standing in the prow of the vessel would have tipped over a long time ago. And very interestingly, if you actually see the large painting up close, the makeup of the crew who are rowing. There's an Afro-American, there's someone wearing a Scots kilt. There's a whole makeup of colonial America in the vessel. It is an incredibly popular visual icon, a cultural icon expressing a view of America as a nation forged in war. And as we think about America today, and I'm not commenting on any particular war, just America today and American expenditures and American, the tremendous faith that is placed in those who have served and those who have risen through service, it is that America culturally sees itself as a society that was forged in war, and that war brought about something very positive in American life, namely the independence of America and the forging of a democratic society. Jump to another country, France. And this is the very, very famous piece of Liberté, Marianne, she's known by Delacroix, and Marianne is on the barricades leading the popular uprising against King Charles X to reestablish French democracy. And again, like the later American painting, the individuals who are engaged represent all classes of society. You have a good bourgeois with his top hat, but beside him in the background, it's hard to see in the light, is someone wearing tradesman's clothes. So it's all classes rising together because France is a nation that is forged by citizen revolt. And if you think about the demonstrations in France today, most any day, Jackie, you go to France often. How often are there demonstrations in France? Every day, daily. It is a nation where part of the cultural identity is we're angry, get out. Dans la rue. Get into the street, show people that we're angry. Because we, the citizens, have created this country through citizen revolt. A visual image, a visual icon showing us something about the culture. And then we come to Canada. Okay? Like the other paintings done after the fact, so this one was painted in 1883. It was actually burnt in the Parliamentary Fire in 1916, repainted from originals, from drafts of various kinds in 1964. A number of people in the corner were added in because they had been at the London Conference in 1866. And this is a composite painting of both the Charlottetown Conference and the Quebec Conference of 1864. And of course, what does it say? It says, like the other paintings, here is an image of Canada. It's the image of Canada as we think about ourselves. We don't, yeah, sure, there's revolts, and yes, there have been a number of instances of civil rebellion, but in fact, as a country, we pride ourselves on talking through, and we pride ourselves on saying, come on, there's a solution to this. We can find a solution. And yes, it may be more boring, but it's a lot less blood, and it's a lot fewer heads being smashed. And remember, the Americans killed more Americans in their Civil War than have ever been killed in any international war that Americans have participated in. So that may give great television 100 years later, American Civil War. This gives a much more peaceable and, how should I put it, kinder society? So, those three paintings, artistic, visual, but they're expressions of national culture, as I said, and also public policy, because all three paintings were in fact funded by public money. Each one was purchased by and funded by and is on display in public places. So Washington Crossing the Delaware is in the Great Metropolitan Museum in New York. And Marianne is, of course, in the Louvre, and she moves from the main Paris Louvre to some of the subsidiary Louvres. And our Confederation debates is in Parliament itself. So I'm going to just review two clear things and keep them in mind. The core concept is that public policy, which is the use of political authority, so right, we're talking in the public policy school. So it's the use of political authority, because it's public, or the decision, the conscious decision not to use public authority to establish institutions like the National Museum, like the library, the National Library and Archives, to establish conditions like taxes, to establish programs, to establish moral leadership, and to do them for the purpose of promoting expression. That's the core concept. When we talk about cultural policies in Canada, there are underlying Canadian values. They are there. They are not necessarily explicit, although in some cases they are explicit. So when that question is said, well, yeah, Canadian culture, do we have culture in Canada? Yeah, what are the values anyhow that we're trying to express in Canada? Mumble, mumble, mumble. Well, hello? It's all there. It's hidden in the open. Or some of the core cultural values of Canada are our official languages, right? It should be self-evident, right? And increasingly heritage languages, right? A possibility of preserving at least some Aboriginal languages. We'll see, okay? A second core cultural policy is our multicultural attitudes, our belief in a diversity of voices. Right? There isn't just a Washington voice or a Hollywood voice. Right? And if you try to do cultural products with only a voice, a singular voice, they try to in Toronto, they don't succeed. Je vous assure qu'il n'y réussit pas. Je vous assure. Right? So Toronto does not succeed to be the voice of Canada. We're decentralized. Right? That's a good thing. It's who we are, like it or not. Right? So we're not just a federal country because of the Constitution of Canada. We're a federal country in the way that cultural policies are administered and are expected to be administered, in how cultural voices are expected to be heard. Issues of national unity, always intrinsic within many of our cultural products. Within cultural policies, the exception of state intervention. Right? The Americans pretend that they do not have state intervention, and to some degree they don't. To some degree they don't have intervention in order to let the biggest win, hence Netflix and Facebook and the others, right? It's neutrality, net neutrality. we accept that there is collective interests and collective intervention. And a growing thing now, not just recently, because it arguably began in the late 1960s, but certainly very, very conscious and outspoken now, is growing recognition and policies to improve the possibility of Indigenous voices. This is it, 150 years or so in one slide, right? That's wonderful. So our policies, our programs, our model has developed consciously over a period of time. And it has done so with some periods being more active and some periods being less active, some periods being more focused on key problems, key issues, others being more focused on existing programs. It has developed over time. And I'm not just being academic and saying, have a look at this. If you were following the Quebec press in the last 3 weeks in reacting to the minister's announcements, I mean, just this morning I was reading in Le Devoir a discussion of the impact of the 1931 Royal Commission on Broadcasting, and doesn't the minister understand that there are continuities since 1931? Can you believe this? Right? So these are living things. These are living developments. The basic point I want to bring out is that cultural policy in Canada is sophisticated. It has multiple programs, multiple dimensions, and it's always aimed at the expression, Canadian voices in Canadian spaces. Dr. Meisel, in 1980, 1981, you're chairing the CRTC. Was that what you were doing? Right? Nothing wrong with continuity. It doesn't mean that it's old, has to be thrown out. It's not digital. Well, let's get rid of Medicare. It's not digital. Oh, unless you have a DRE. This types of interventions, very quickly, we have developed a cultural ecosystem. It's an ecosystem that flows across a continuum between creation, between production, between the distribution of products, the consumption of products, how are they consumed, where are they consumed, the preservation of products. Right? It's an entire ecosystem. And there's a policy ecosystem that supports that. And it's made up of licensing, of regulations, of funding, of various independent agencies and arm's length agencies, of education programs, obviously of moral force. Now, all of this is background. All of this is to lead us up to where are we with this revolution, supposed revolution. Because remember, the minister said, quote unquote, everything is on the table. Quote unquote. Those were the big headlines a year ago. Everything is on the table. And in the discussions that have been taking place around digital policy development, the advisors of various kinds, the people making submissions have said, Minister, you said everything is on the table. What about? And then they ask questions. So are all regulations on the table? Is the licensing system on the table? Is the National Education Program, National Theatre School, the Royal Winnipeg Ballet School, these are all national schools funded through the federal government. Are they all on the table? Chop, chop. What's on the table? Minister said everything is on the table. Keep it in mind. Last thing I'm going to point to, just to put things in perspective, just how large the thing called cultural industries and cultural products have become. These are stats from 2010, which was compiled again in 2014 by Stats Canada. So getting to be a little bit out of date, but they are the most recent. In terms of jobs, 4% of the labor market directly employed in various aspects of cultural industries arts production, arts creation, 4% of the labor market. GDP, you see the numbers. This is the one that always gets me. Arts and culture direct GDP is more than double the direct GDP of agriculture, fish, forestry, and hunting. Right? We think about Canada and we say, oh, we're a country of farmers, fisheries on the East Coast, God knows I spent half my life there, forestry, hunting, culture, more than double. All kinds of numbers about participation. But essentially, and number 83% is only one way of measuring it, essentially almost all Canadians report that they have participated in, attended some arts or cultural event in the previous year. Okay? So it's loosely defined. It doesn't mean that we're all running out to museums and films and reading the latest book, e-book, not e-book, but we're participating in some manner. All kinds of production coming through the various programs that help it. Okay, all of that is context, and now up to the latest news. And the latest news is the release on September the 28th of the Digital Policy Review. And the latest news is that everything was not on the table. Believe me, I have not set up a straw man to knock it down, right? That everything is on the table was repeated constantly. Well, guess what? Everything was not on the table, which is a very good thing. Because let me tell you, 5 months ago, within the various creative industry sectors, people were pulling their hair out and saying, what the hell is going on? What is the government up to? And because ministerial mandate letters are available publicly, people knew what the minister's mandate was. And so the question was, what is the secret agenda? What the hell is going on? So everything was not on the table. What was on the table was a repackaging and a re-announcing of many of the things that make up the Canadian cultural model, but with a new title, now called Creative Canada. So, if you go to the Canadian Heritage website, and one other thing, it's very hard to navigate federal government websites now, right? Yeah, I mean, really hard, because somebody had the smart idea that everything should be in a portal called Canada.ca. That was a very smart idea in 1995, 1996. Everything is now grouped together under one. So when you start to look for one thing, you very quickly get pushed into the latest press release from Minister of Veterans Affairs. It's very difficult to navigate. So you look it up, and you have to look it up now under Creative Canada. And with those words, Creative Canada, you're likely to find some of the information. Problem was, Creative Canada was also a CBC slogan a year ago. And so Creative Canada may also lead you back, well, how many slogans can you have? So just keep this in mind. There are praiseworthy adjustments that were announced, right? So there will be increased money to the Canada Media Fund, CMF. If you watch any Canadian film, any Canadian program, particularly a drama program, you'll see at the very end a series of logos, just like in Hollywood films or international films, you know, producers, and they put the logos of it, executive producer, also produced by. Producer really means who finds the money and who, in exchange for that money, gets whose boyfriend, whose girlfriend on the screen for some period of time. That's the way Hollywood works. So here in Canada, at the end, they do the sponsorship one. CMF is the biggest source of funding for the production of video, new media video, video games. And the CMF is funded by, its own internal funding comes from a 5% off the top contribution. It's not called a tax, it's called a contribution from the cable companies plus a contribution annually by the Government of Canada. Okay? And the problem is that as the cable companies have been losing market share, in part because of this thing called streaming, their contributions to the CMF have been going down. But the entire Canadian film and video game production industry depends on the CMF for initial funding, risk-taking funding. The private funding comes in after that. The CMF is the first window for funding. So the government has said, we understand there's a problem. We assure you that the CMF is going to remain stable. There will be money announced in the 2018 budget to top up the CMF. Exactly how much of the top-up is not announced. And if any of you enjoy reading weasel words, as we call them, mealy-mouth words, where you're trying to avoid saying anything specific, read the wording on the commitment on the media fund. You will not understand what the top-up amount is going to be. And I'm an expert. I wrote weasel words for 35 years. Whoever wrote this did really well. So you really don't know what it's going to be. But there is a commitment, okay? Take that seriously. There's going to be money for something called Creative Hubs. Creative Hubs is another way of saying that there's going to be production centers of various types together with education programs in various cities. And it being Canada, go back to our value about everything being regional and diverse. There's not going to be a creative hub in Toronto and Montreal. There's going to be creative hubs in Vancouver, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, I don't know, probably Sudbury. You know, makes sense. Why not? That's what Canada is. We're Northern Ontario, not just Southern Ontario. We're certainly Newfoundland. We're not just Halifax, are we? God help us if we're just Halifax. So that's Canada. That's who we are. It's great. A creative export strategy. So the export strategy that had been devised and put into place called Trade Routes in the mid-1990s, and that had been taken apart under the Harper government, it is being recreated and different little ribbons and so on attached to it, real money attached to it. So that's been re-announced. That is a good thing. Renewal of the CBC mandate. Again, there were questions about that. Would the CBC has to get licensed like everybody else? Its license was coming up for renewal. The government has said unequivocally, CBC is going to get its renewal. Of course it's going to get it. But they've said it in a positive manner. These are good things. A whole series of difficult areas. Now, remember, this digital cultural review was announced in April of 2016. So now we're in October of 2017. So that's 18 months later. 18 months is not a long time. Let's say you were in Detroit. Does Detroit still produce new cars? Yes. So you're in Detroit and you're designing a new model, a new type of car. 18 months is not such a long time. But 18 months for a policy area, which is actually a mature policy area, right? So it's a policy area that's got a good 150 years under its belt, and 70 years particularly of recent stuff. 18 months is a long time. Right? All the difficult areas for the cultural policy review remain to be decided. Leading once again, of course, to the suspicion, if everything is on the table, are the undecided things the ones that are still on the table? Dum, da-dum, dum. What's really happening, or is nothing happening? We don't know. So, some of the big issues. Big issue number one, Telecommunications Act, which is the Telephone Act, Broadcasting Act, are going to be, quote, reviewed. And some say, well, they really should be combined because telecoms now, and broadcasting now is really part of telecoms, and it's all using the same pipes and wires. These are huge issues technically and legally. Right? They are complex. Anybody who says, oh yeah, why don't they put them together? You look at that person and say, oh, come on. You know, what are you using for thinking today? These are complex issues worth multiple billions of dollars. Multiple billions. Okay? So it's going to be reviewed. The CRTC, the Canada Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, so the independent arm's length commissioner, like the FCC in the United States, although the CRTC is more independent than the American FCC, much more independent. The CRTC has been asked to, quote, report on future distribution issues, which is a complicated way of saying we know that cultural products are being distributed in different ways now, notably through the different digital media platforms. In what way will those platforms, your personal watching of a film on your little set, your this, your that, in what way can those platforms be used to contribute to Canadian content, the Canada Media Fund, and so on and so on. So, big issue. Exactly the issue that people thought was going to be discussed last April, 2016. Copyright laws are going to have a parliamentary review. Okay? Parliamentary review. Parliamentary review. That means a committee of Parliament, Heritage Committee, although it's copyright, so it's probably going to be the Heritage Committee and the Industry Committee, or whatever it's being called today. We'll have a joint committee to listen to multiple witnesses on the issue of copyright. In English, it's the right to copy. In French, it's droit de l'auteur, the right of the author. So even in the names, English and French, you get the total conflict between what's involved in copyright. Normally, copyright renewal of any kind takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years. It is very, very complicated. It's the third rail of cultural policy. No minister wants to touch it. I have been in cabinet meetings where ministers are shouting at each other, trying to find a compromise between the right of the author and the right of the copier, the right of the user. But the policy review has announced that there's going to be a policy review. And the last one, the last and perhaps the most important one, local news. Local news in Canada will now have access to the periodical fund, which is money that is set aside for magazines in particular. But the minister has said, quote unquote, there's no easy solutions facing this sector, quote unquote. He also said in another quote, well, newspapers, you know, that's old technology. It's the same minister who said that everything is on the table. So we don't know what's going to happen. What we do know is that there was a parliamentary committee on the issue of local news, which reported publicly about 3 months ago with 19 recommendations. One recommendation had to do with tax, and the Prime Minister said, oh no, no new tax. But the other 18 recommendations are all substantive, very substantive. And there has been absolutely no response, no action. And in this announcement on September 26th, no reference to the parliamentary committee report that was done painstakingly on the issue of funding of news and local news. So why I was sounding just a little bit skeptical about the copyright review by a parliamentary review, hell man, on the easy issue of local news, there has been no reaction to a sensible, useful report. God knows what they're going to do with a copyright review. Mr. Speaker, am I making sense, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, you are.
As always. Thank you, sir. The finest speaker in modern history. Don't forget that. Especially because he said something nice. But in one area, the announcement, and I'm nearing my end now, in one area, the announcement by the government on the digital policy review did come up with a substantive announcement, a very strange announcement. And that has to do with this field called streaming, or OTT, over the top. Why it's over the top of the cable system. So OTT streaming, and you know about Netflix, and I'm sure, okay, the truth now. How many in this room have a Netflix subscription? How many in the room do not have a Netflix subscription? How many in the room bypass Netflix by using other systems, like VPNs Come on. Come on. Liars, come on. So, we're talking about a humongous issue. It's estimated in the evening hours that 1/3 of Canadian cable distribution capacity, right? 1/3 of the capacity of the data that is being distributed for Netflix. That's how big it is. And so the minister went down to Hollywood and she negotiated. We don't know what her mandate was, whether she had a mandate. We don't know if there were officials in the room. Golden rule of government is if there's no official in the room, the meeting did not take place. Right? Because officials keep neutral notes. That's how it works. You can have an informal discussion, but it's not a formal meeting unless there is a note taker. So the result is the announcement that Netflix is going to apply, probably, we're not sure, through Investment Canada, probably, to establish something called Netflix Canada. But so far, at least, it's going to have privilege rules. There will be no consumer taxes on Netflix. There will be no CanCon rules. In fact, we don't even know what will apply to Netflix Canada. So Bell, Shaw, Videotron, all the others, they pay taxes. They comply up to a point, at least on their products, with Canadian content rules. But Netflix does not, nor do others who are, unless it's Amazon.ca, if it's Amazon.com, if it's NewYorkTimes.com, they do not comply with anything. Okay? And the deal with Netflix, as announced so far, is that Netflix will now become Netflix Canada, but don't expect those rules to apply to us. I put down here nicely, the reactions are very negative. From the Toronto Star, even the Globe and Mail, which hopes that it will become like Netflix, but especially in Quebec, I would not repeat in public the words that actually appear in print about the minister and about the announced deal and so on. The sheer lack of trust, of belief and respect is extraordinary. And the minister herself appeared on the most important and most viewed public affairs program 2 Sundays ago, Tout le monde en parle. Everybody's talking about it, that's the name of the program. And she was shredded to mincemeat. Okay? And basically they said to her, all you're doing is repeating your talking points, you're not listening to the questions. So this does not reflect well, not just on a person, but on a government and on the view that Canada federally is actually capable and interested in dealing with the issues facing culture in Quebec and culture in Canada. So essentially the question is, has the federal government caved in? Or are they looking at digital media and saying, well, we don't know what to do about it? And there's so much American money behind it, and NAFTA is going on, and nothing should happen until NAFTA is solved. Everybody, go home. Nothing. And is that basically what's happened to the federal government? Okay. Quebec's reaction has been, we are going to apply Quebec HST, Quebec, the GST in Quebec to any subscriptions purchased from Netflix, and at least in Quebec, Netflix will have to compete on an equal ground with regard to sales tax with any other communications provider. And the minister's reaction, the federal minister said, oh well, Quebec is free to do what Quebec wants to do. The real issue is, what about all the other streaming services? Right? There is Amazon, Hulu, Spotify, name it. And frankly, if I were Rogers, I would go and set up Rogers USA and just stream into Canada. Why not? They probably have already incorporated the name of the company. Because why not? Why should I be taxed here if my competitors are not taxed? Why aren't they taxed? Because you're shit scared? What's the issue? So, the underlying tensions. And these are the tensions of public policy affecting cultural content. Firstly, can the internet be governed in the public interest? Many countries are now saying yes. We know we've gone through this startup period of 15 years, Wired magazine, internet is free, everything is free. Nobody has to pay rights. We can take all your newspaper stories that cost you lots of money to develop, but we're going to put it on our Yahoo site and we don't have to pay for them. So, can the internet be governed? Can it be governed by copyright laws? Can it be governed for false news? Я не говорю по-русски. Oh, you're Russian. Then we don't have to govern you. You can say whatever you want. You're on the internet. It's free. The European Union has ruled, it's much stiffer rules on privacy, rules now on local content, right? So there's 28 countries, or is it 28 minus 1? On the collection of taxes. In an article I was just reading this morning, the argument is that there are 100 countries now that follow the OECD recommendation that there should be sales taxes applied to all internet-based purchasing. Right? But not Canada. We're good. An underlying issue. The FANGs, right? That's Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. Are they really broadcasting entities? Okay? Do they pull programming together so that it's broadcasting as opposed to just being, we enable content to be streamed to you that you've reacted for, that's merely a personal relationship between you and the content creator. And the last and the most important, ultimately, is on local news. I won't go into it, time is going. And here's my two conclusions. What the government announced is dealing with the easy programs, the ones that are under domestic control. It's easy for a government to say, yeah, subsidy programs we've got now, we're going to add a little bit to the subsidy. The government has so far wasted an immense opportunity to deal with online taxes. Potentially, it's opened a can of worms with the Americans. I bet you there's a NAFTA table where they're talking about the minister's responses and the minister's Netflix arrangement. And if it isn't, it's because the minister's already given it away. There are tremendous potential risks, always the nationalist risk. It is there, plus other issues. And now my last conclusion, and this is for all the policy wonks in the room. Number one, don't make policy on the fly. Don't announce that you're having a digital policy review before you've actually studied carefully what you want the review to cover, what it's likely to do, how it's going to do it, how it relates to existing policy. Don't get a bright idea over the weekend because you think you're going to get lots of nice headlines next week. Don't do it on the fly. Don't ever announce that everything is on the table unless you mean it. On the other hand, don't get spooked by the difficulties. Public policy is difficult. It's public because private interests couldn't settle it. So whether it's public policy on health, public policy on veterans payments, public policy on PTSD and school kids coming as refugees, public policy is difficult, right? Don't get spooked by the difficulties. And then my last one. It always takes guts to sustain Canadian culture and Canadian values. It always has. It's always been difficult. And it will continue to be difficult. That's it. That's all.